Welcome to r/Malicious Compliance, where we share stories of people conforming to the letter, but not the spirit of request. Thank you, friends, for subscribing to the channel and for so many likes. The first story. I told the area supervisor that it wasn't the right paint. He told me to do it anyway, or lose my job. The second story. Recording engineer didn't like my bass guitar. He decided to redo everything and was left without 2 speakers. The third story. We tried to warn the boss that this whole project is going to be a nightmare, but he simply ignored us. The first story is, sure, I'll repaint the islands with the wrong paint. This one I felt kinda bad for because it involved a few injuries. Very minor ones, luckily. I didn't want to do it, but it came down to my job, so I complied. Here is the story. Years and years ago, back in the early 90s, I worked as a manager at a gas station. We had a great area supervisor who decided to retire. We were all very sad, and even more sad when her replacement came in. He was a total butt. He had just come out of retiring from the military and felt that with his military experience he could whip us into shape. One of the things he wanted done was make the stations look good, which I'm 100% for, but also do it with as little money as possible, which was fine if it was the right thing to do. This time, one of several, it wasn't. So around the pumps are these raised islands. The islands are painted on top with a special paint that has a good grit to it, so when it gets wet from rain or whatever and people stand on them, they don't slip and fall. Well, this area's supervisor wanted the islands repainted, so he got some paint out of our supply depot and dropped it off at all the stations he ran. No problem. I went around myself and painted the sides of all the islands. They look great, but the tops of them were not painted. So he shows up one day to inspect and sees that the tops aren't painted. Asks me why. I told him this isn't the right paint. It has to be the gritty, thick paint because we don't want customers slipping and falling. He starts yelling at me, tells me he's going to fire me if they aren't repainted by the next day, blah blah blah, and says that it's not my responsibility to worry about the customers. It's his. Total egotistical mindset. Do as I say, don't think. So, I did what he said. I repainted all the tops of the islands that day. Nice warm day in the fall. Hadn't gotten wet yet, really. Next day, he shows up, looks around, and has this grin on his face that he beat me into submission type of thing. Says something like, see, next time just do what I say, don't question my judgment. I just nodded, knowing what was about to come. And dreading it, because I knew that the customer was going to be the victim here. But there was nothing I could do. A week later, we get our first rain. Some of our islands stayed dry under the canopy, but about half of them got wet because the rain was coming in somewhat sideways. And then, it happens. Lady gets out of her car in nice shoes with no grip, steps on the island, slips, and falls. She's not really hurt, just a bit on her backside and back, but we call the ambulance anyway. She's peeved. I just tell her to build a station and give her the address to make a claim against my area supervisor's info. Then it happens 3 more times over the next couple days. 2 of them were very minor, but the customers were also peeved, but didn't get an ambulance or go to the hospital, but they also got the contact information of my area manager. Then number 4 happened. Could have been much worse, but this guy was dressed in a super nice and apparently expensive suit, slipped and fell with the hose in his hand right after taking it out of the car. He twisted his ankle, cue ambulance, and a few drops of gas got on his clothes. I again provide my area supervisor's info. Then the weather dries up and the problem goes away for that week at least. About 10 days later, my area supervisor drives into my station with his boss. I had met his boss a couple times. Cool guy. Kinda one of those people that don't take BS from anybody, but is super down to earth and reasonable. Apparently, the nice suit guy was a lawyer. He's filed a lawsuit against the station for medical bills, pain, and suffering, and the replacement of his super expensive suit. I don't know what the lawsuit was for, but it was way over 10 grand. So the area supervisor and his boss come up to me to discuss the situation. I told them that wasn't the only incident, as I had filed my paperwork as I was supposed to. There was a total of 4 while it was raining. The big boss asked me why this was all of a sudden a problem. I looked at the area supervisor, who I could tell on his face was hoping I was going to say something untrue. But nope, I'm going to tell it exactly how it was. I laid it all out. I told him what I was given. I told him that I didn't paint the tops originally. That I told the area supervisor that it wasn't the right paint. He told me to do it anyway or lose my job. I even told him that the area supervisor told me that customer safety wasn't my responsibility. It was his, which is why I gave everyone who got injured the area supervisor's information. The big boss asked me a couple of questions, then turned to the area supervisor and said something like, okay, I have what I need, let's go, and they left. Surprisingly, the area supervisor kept his job after that, but had it out for me. I quit a few months later with no notice for a better job, but he got a huge reaming. Not only that, but his expenses were huge that quarter. He ended up on the bottom of the list rank-wise of area supervisors for costs for the quarter. They ended up having to have crews go to all his stations, strip off the bad paint, and repaint all the tops of the islands with the thick, gritty paint. And it had to be done fast before the next rain came in. So huge expense. All he had to do was get me a can or two and the other stations of the gritty paint, and I would have gladly used it. But because he had an ego and thought he knew best, it cost the company and his area the settlement of the lawsuit, the other injury claim, and the cost of the crews to come out and repaint all the tops. I'm just glad the injuries were minor. The next story is, just pluck a string despite me warning you? I hope you've budgeted new speakers then. This one stems from 10 years ago. Back then, I was called upon to sit as a bass player on a recording session for a Mersey beat-influenced song for a singer-songwriter, SSW, who was still forming a touring band. The SSW had a certain sound in mind, which needed a really fat bass tone that was used in the 60s, and I happened to have the right tool for the job, a Gibson EB2 from the mid-1960s. So I got a call since the SSW heard I had that bass and asked if he could loan it, or even better if I wanted to play on the session. It was easy money with no further obligations, so I agreed. So I arrived at the session with my bass and chord sheet and noticed everything was already installed, so it was plug and play. Nowadays, a bass line is recorded as a double track. The signal from the instrument is split, with one line going straight into the mixing console, and the other one is going through an amplifier that has a microphone. Then when mixing the song, both signals are blended so you have articulation from the direct line and character from the mic signal. So I took my bass, tuned it silently with a clip-on tuner, plugged it straight into the amp, twiddling the knobs to get a fairly neutral sound, making sure I put the master volume at 0, and then slowly up. Meanwhile, the recording engineer that day tossed me an extra cable and junction box that I needed to place between my bass and the amplifier so he could run the clean signal straight into the table. That RE had a bit of a pretentious air surrounding him, pretending to know it all better and bossing the musicians around, belittling them at the same time. He took a look at the bass, rolled his eyes, and said that a modern music man would be better suited and was more versatile, instead of that old hag that probably sounded like a turd. The old hag Gibson EB2 was a very popular bass back in the 1960s, but nowadays it has faded a bit into obscurity. It's a one-trick pony, but it absolutely excels at its sole trick, producing absolutely gargantuan levels of low-end frequency. Don't expect any clarity, articulation, or finesse from it. It sounds like a wet fart coming from the anus of Satan himself. On top of that, it has an extremely high signal output, dwarfing even the output of active instruments with onboard amplifiers. The pickup responsible for that all has earned a nickname of its own, a mudbucker, because all it does is producing mud. Back in the days, those Gibson EB basses had a reputation of being able, with normal use, to fry any loudspeaker within minutes just by their sheer power. The sole exception being the Ampeg Portaflex amps, which were built like a tank. So I was ready, and the RE, who since had retreated to the control room, told me to play something to get the levels right. Via the talkback, a mic used to be able to speak with the control room. I told him that I already adjusted the amp to my liking, but that I advised him to turn the volume of the direct line to 0 on his side and turn it up slowly. I was rather rudely interrupted that he knew what he was doing, and that I just needed to pluck a string so we could get on. So that's what I did. I plucked the string. At that very moment, I saw his eyes basically pop out of his sockets, and him frantically mash a button on the mixing console. I don't know what happened at the other side of the window, but I'm fairly sure that the EB2 claimed the life of 2 rather expensive studio speakers, the cones being blasted, or at least having to produce one hell of a distorted and overdriven signal that they were not designed for. The session itself was nothing special. 1 playthrough as a rehearsal, 4 takes, and it was a wrap. I didn't stick around for the playback, but I heard from the SSW that he had to initially listen to the track via headphones, and not via the speakers in the control room. I received a final mix a few weeks later, but the SSW decided to shelve the song, with it not really fitting the rest of his material. The Gibson got sold a few years later, as it was a bit too valuable to keep in relation to its usage. I now have a cheaper EB3 with the same pickup as the EB2, its output being even more monstrous. The last story is, ignoring the developer? It's your money. I was at the beginning of my career as a developer intern at a local IT company. I was still attending university classes. The agreement was that I would be working 6 hours a week. We were creating a web application with a central user management system. Important later, you could use the same credentials for the different modules. This meant a metric tons of users created for testing, and it was the same data set as the client's demo accounts with live email addresses. The company hired 4 other interns like me, 1 senior developer and 1 part-time developer. No architect, nobody to design the architecture. The project was not on a tight budget, yet they wanted to save money on everything. They wanted to use the internal framework that was supposed to make things easier. Spoilers, it made our lives a nightmare, but the order was to use that. We had no say in it. We tried to warn the boss that this whole project is going to be a nightmare, but he simply ignored us at those rare times when he was at the office. We've been missing deadlines every time. Nothing was working properly. The system was slow. A logical response from the company was to make us do overtime. We were working 10 hours a day while studying for classes, preparing for end-of-term exams. The remaining time we were trying to socialize, family, girlfriend, etc. It soon turned out that we need to put much more effort into the project than the company intended to. The framework had tons of bugs. Every release was a nightmare. 12-hour workdays became regular. One of the interns 270 hours of work in a month. We were paid by the hour. At least we were compensated in a way. The test user database has been used by the client for demo purposes. It had their live email addresses with proper group memberships. Every action made in the app sent an email to a group that was eventually sent out to the client as well. They could just simply ignore that. That was around 10 emails a day. After a year, I was at the end of my university years, and it slipped out of my mouth that I don't feel inclined to support this big pile of bug. The boss asked me to come into his office. He told me that they were not satisfied with my performance, and they won't offer me a full-time position after I would graduate. This was the point where I snapped. They gave me an option to either get my SH together or leave. I've noticed that the email service was not working on the test environment, yet it was scheduled. This means that the email has been put in the queue but not delivered. I've mentioned this to the senior developer. He ignored me like I was the idiot who's not going to be there anyway. I was sitting there like I should care. I admit, I even got upset about this. Then it hit me. I'll just let them do what they want. Once the service is fixed, it'll explode eventually. Once I had my degree in hand, I had left the company. The other interns also got their degree, but they were offered a full-time position. One of them left 3 weeks after me leaving. They insisted to a probation period for him, but didn't expect him to actually leave. He did. Another guy left around 2 months after that. Here comes the best part. They fixed the email service after a month. In 1 hour, around 400,000 emails were sent to every user in the system. The mail server could handle the load, but the client had to assort these one by one. They threatened the team with contacting the CEO. The team already had a bad reputation because of the missed deadline. Somehow, they managed to push the app live. The requirements said that 500 concurrent users should properly be handled by the server the client had already paid for, but it couldn't keep up with the load. The company had to buy around 200 gigabytes of RAM. They've run out of budget way before the initial live release. The company had to pay more in terms of hardware and penalty than the original budget was. After leaving the company, I got a full-time job with fractions of stress and a more employee-friendly environment. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.